Welcome to week 4, where we talk about the Seleucids and the Hasmoneans. Seleucids being the Syrian dynasty, and the Hasmoneans being the dynasty that follows the Maccabean revolt, so the Jewish. So this is a Jewish dynasty, so the Syrian dynasty and the Jewish dynasty that overlapped in the 2nd century. So I'm not going to say a lot about the book of Maccabees, but a lot of the history we're going to talk about, it comes from that book. That's one of the major sources we have for this time period. And from some odd reason, the Maccabees were their nickname, but when they began to reign as a family, they take on the family name. So Maccabees and Hasmoneans are the same thing, basically. So let's get started. So basically, we're talking now, when we talk about the history that stands behind Daniel 7, the section of Enoch, so the 2nd century, we're really starting to look at the influence of the Roman Empire beginning to be felt on the area of Palestine. And basically, the Roman Empire placed a pretty heavy tax burden on the areas around it, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, these descendant dynasties of Alexander the Great. And so one of the process or ways that emperors collected their taxes was to actually just skim money off the temples of the region. So it wasn't just the Jerusalem temple, but all of these temples of the Mesopotamian and Palestinian region were the sources of great gold and silver and precious objects. So whenever a king needed to pay off a tax burden or to bribe someone, one of the places to do that was just to sort of enter the temple, whichever temple it was, and skim off a little from the top. So this was basically the way things happened back then in this century. So we get to then the year 198. So 198 CE. And I have a couple things I want you to pay attention to. Don't get too caught up in the dates, but I do want you to get a sense of how things change after 198 in terms of the leadership of the temple and of Jerusalem in general. And this is a major part of the history that sets up the New Testament, and it is the history that Daniel 7 and Enoch 9, the animal apocalypse references, is the history of this period. So let's start, like I said, with the year 198. In 198, Antiochus III, he took over the region of Jerusalem, or he took Jerusalem and the environs from the Egyptians. And he was actually welcomed. He was considered a patron of the temple. And so at first this didn't seem like too much of a problem. But again, under pressure from the Romans, he was under increasing pressure to come up with funds, and this is what began to be a problem just for the whole region. So in 198, so I wanted to then talk about the leadership in Jerusalem, the high priests. So the high priestly family, or should I say all priestly families, it was something you were born into. So you were born of a priestly family, and if you were born of a priestly family, then you served in the temple. Now there were various lines within the priestly families, but the one that controlled the high priests were the descendants of Zadok, or the Zadokites. Basically from the exile on, the return from the exile on, for about 150 years, one particular Zadokite family controlled the high priesthood. So it went to the eldest son of the eldest son, unbroken for about 150 years leading up to the period that we're talking about. So I want the first high priest that I want to talk about is Simon the Third, and he is the one who's known as the Just, and he is the one that is mentioned in Sirach 90 as one of the, excuse me, not Sirach 90, but it mentioned in Sirach as the great high priest. His son, and so he was high priest, let's see, he was high priest in 198 when Antiochus IV took over. Then Onias III was his son, and he reigned as high priest from 196 to 175. So during the reign of Antiochus III, these were the high priests during his time period, and they represent traditional Judaism. Or should I say, traditional in the sense of traditional versus a more Hellenized version. Antiochus III did not push a Hellenistic agenda. So these Simon III, Onias III, were both in the tradition, strong Hebrew tradition. So they were traditionalists, and basically Onias, and I'll say this right now, was considered to be the last legitimate high priest for many, many, many years. So it is this is the last guy that was looked to as unequivocally the right man to be in that position. So Antiochus III dies, and his son Seleucus the fourth takes over, and he reigns from 187 to 175. So we go back over here. Onias III reigns during this period, but I also want you to notice that his reign as high priest ends the same year as Seleucus IV's death. So, because that's a big deal right there. Seleucus IV had a son and a grandson, but Antiochus IV, his brother, we know about him, so he's the brother, he's the one that takes over as the Syrian king. So let me say something about that for a second. We're going to talk about Daniel 7 in a second, and it talks about the 10 horns, and then the horns that are supplanted in order that the little horn be speak its arrogant words. And that's just so very, don't get bogged down in the details, but basically this is an attempt to reflect the history. Seleucus the fourth was murdered by one of his ministers. His son was actually at that point being held hostage in Rome. The Romans would do this to control the ruling families around in their conquered territories or dominated territories. So his son was actually in Rome, and the Romans refused to give him up. So Seleucus IV is, so the son is not, and I won't burden you with his name, Demetrius, but he was in Rome and therefore could not take over. Now, the son had a son, so the Seleucid's grandson, so Seleucus' grandson, but he was an infant. So this is really how Antiochus IV becomes king. He Seleucus is murdered. Demetrius is the second is in line, but the Romans refuse to let him leave. The only remaining the next in line is an infant, and so Antiochus, his brother, takes over as king, calls himself Antiochus IV, and operates for a little while as a co-regent with this infant. But ultimately, Antiochus IV kills the infant and ends the co-regency. So, depending on how you think about this, Antiochus was personally responsible for only one death here, but he was fourth in line. So there was a lot, the idea of supplanting is very much what this is what it's referring to. So hold that in your mind when we go back to Daniel 7. Okay. So let's see. So Antiochus IV reigns from 175 to 164. Now, I think I've already talked about his name, Epiphanes. Epiphanes means the manifest one, or the God on earth, basically, is what he was claiming. And Epimanes being his nickname, crazy guy, and his attempt to, at first, Hellenize the Jews. So at first he just wanted to Hellenize them, and then they just became a big problem. And so to suppress Judaism altogether became his goal. So Antiochus the Fourth. So, like I said, Onias the Third, because he is a traditionalist, he is removed from the throne from the high priesthood in 175. His Onias's brother, Jason, actually who is very much a Hellenistic Jew. Hellenistic Jew, much more favorable to Antiochus IV. So, and basically he buys the high priesthood. He buys it from Antiochus, and Antiochus gives it to him because their view is a little more in line with each other. Now we have a problem because Onias is still alive, and Jason is a brother. He's the second son, and so this is not his to have, but he has bought it, and so he gets it, and he reigns from 175 to 172. So still during the reign of Antiochus IV. So what happens next, once the thing goes up for sale, Jason sends one of his one of his ministers or courtiers to Antiochus IV to pay off his, the price for being high priest, and instead Menelaus was his name, outbids him. He shows up with Jason's money and says, "But I've got even more, make me the high priest." And Antiochus IV has no problem doing that. So from 172 to 162, Menelaus is the high priest. Now the thing about Menelaus is that he's not even a Zadokite. So he's not legitimate in any way. So this would be a big problem, and it really helps set up the what goes on during Antiochus IV's reign. So we talk about, I've already mentioned all the stuff that Antiochus does, but when it comes to the temple itself, but the whole high priesthood now is bought and sold and owned, at least on the surface, by Antiochus. And so you can imagine what the people who weren't, or the more traditional Jews would have thought about this. So Menelaus, big problem. So let's then, in so we got Menelaus, so 172 to 162, and we have Antiochus the Fourth, the crazy guy. And so basically starting about 169, Antiochus has just everybody wants Egypt. It's like the history of the ancient Near East. Everybody wants Egypt. So Antiochus the Fourth is off trying to conquer Egypt when rumors are spread around Jerusalem. So there are these rumors start to appear that that he had died in battle in Egypt. So lots of stuff starts to happen back in Rome back in Jerusalem, where they think now that Antiochus the Fourth is gone, there's a little freedom. So Antiochus the Fourth returns, and basically as a part, it's a part of the punishment for what was going on at this period, that in 167 he enters and desecrates the temple. So again, this is Hanukkah. In the New Testament, reference the sacrilege of that desecrates and all that. This is a big, big, big deal. So I'm going to add then, if we've got the high priest family over here, so the high priest. Over here we've got the Syrian dynasty. I'm going to add another group into the middle, and that is, and I've talked about him already, Mattathias, who, when Antiochus IV's suppression of Judaism spreads to the countryside, he's forced to, or he's attempted to force to make a sacrifice to a false god and all that. He kills the other Jew who did make the sacrifice, and he and his many sons fight, rise up, and then begin a guerrilla warfare, particularly led by his son Judah. So so basically we date the reign of Judah. I'm going ahead of myself a bit here. But Mattathias dies in one of the initial battles, but he leaves behind Judah, who is the one who is nicknamed the Hammer, which is what the word Maccabee means. So you've got this illegitimate high priest. You've got Antiochus IV just fed up with the problems the Jews are causing him in his own mind. And, despite how some people might portray it, the Jews of this period were very, very flexible. But, anybody can be pushed too far. And this is when that happened, was this date 165. So basically then, Mattathias and his sons, they, and in 165, the temple is rededicated because Judah and his soldiers have managed to re-enter the temple. But that doesn't mean, but we're not yet at the Hasmonean dynasty. These two men are the founders of that dynasty, but the fact that they control the temple, they're still locked in a major battle with Antiochus IV. In 164, or his soldiers anyway, in 164, Antiochus IV dies of a disease in fighting. He was leading his troops in what's modern-day Iran. He had left one of his generals behind to fight the battle in Jerusalem. And so he dies of a disease in what would be modern-day Iran now, so far away. So everything is a muddle. You've got, someone who's determined to destroy Judaism, an illegitimate high priest in the minds of many, many individuals, and then this fact that they finally get fed up, and the rise of this family known as the Hasmoneans. So let me sort of start again. So that we've got Jason, Menelaus, Mattathias and his son Judah, and Antiochus IV. So these are the figures. So basically, 175. Menelaus, his reign comes to an end in 162. Sorry about that. He outbids, in another figure comes along named Alcimus, who outbids Menelaus and is the high priest from 162 to 160, perhaps 159. He is, unlike Menelaus, at least a Zadokite. He is not the proper Zadokite line, but a lot of people are fairly okay with at least when Alcimus is appointed, because at least he's of the right family. Judah dies. He sort of runs the army from 165 to 160. He actually dies in a battle with some of Alcimus's troops, and back and forth. And when Judah dies, it goes through several of his brothers. Jonathan becomes the next leader of the Maccabean family, and so of course this is, I should put this in here, Seleucus the Fifth takes over in 164 and reigns during the rest of this period. But Jonathan in 142, he reigns from 160 to 142, or at least leads the army from 160 to 142. The big date here is 152, where when Jonathan seizes Jerusalem. So by 152, and it's so complicated because you're probably thinking, well, they had Jerusalem, but they did and they didn't. It was an ongoing civil war, essentially. And so back and forth, who was in control of this region. But in 152, Jonathan seizes Jerusalem and basically takes full control. So by Jonathan, you get in 152 he seizes Jerusalem, and then he declares himself high priest. So this then, Alcimus dies, Jonathan becomes the high priest. So you have then, with Jonathan, the beginning of the connection between the political military and the religious. So a lot of stuff's going to come out of this, because you're thinking that's a lot detailed. Well, it is, and like I said, don't get too bogged down in it. But I'm talking about the history, what the first Maccabees. I'm talking about Daniel 7. I'm talking about Enoch, the animal apocalypse, and I'm also preparing us for the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran community, because Alcimus, you may have noticed this, that Jonathan, Alcimus dies in 160. Jonathan is in control of the armies, the Maccabean armies, but he does not declare himself high priest until 152. And therein is where we get it's one of the mysteries of history. We have basically 7 years of silence. We do not know who the high priest was during this period. The intriguing thing about this is that there is an otherwise unnamed figure called the Teacher of Righteousness, whose dates fall very interestingly into this period. We don't ever get his name, but the teacher of righteousness is the one who basically becomes the leader of the Qumran community. And so this is a real important sort of, again, it's a supposition, we can't know, but 7 years where we don't have any figure referred to as being high priest, but the Qumran material talks about this figure named teacher of righteousness, whose dates and the things seem to indicate that he could very well have been the one who was the high priest. So basically then, to finish this out, Jonathan declares himself, like I said, high priest. His brother then, Simon, so like I said, Matthias had lots of brothers, follows Jonathan when Jonathan dies in 142, and he is the first person who can who does legitimately control both Jerusalem as king and as high priest. And so we can call this whole thing the Hasmonean dynasty, but it becomes a reality under Simon in 142. So, and it is not until the Romans take direct control for another about 100 years that this region is self-ruled in a way. So, the just a little synopsis here. Basically, we can't. What's important for bring away Antiochus IV and his persecution of the Jews. It is central to the history of this period and to the writings of this period. It influences so many of them. It is the flowering of apocalyptic, but his role, it can't be underplayed. But also what I've demonstrated or shown you is the rise of the Hasmoneans, how a man named Matthias and his son Judah went from fighting a guerrilla warfare to having, by all within among the same family and all among brothers, they go from just a guerrilla band of fighters to kings and high priests. So so they become, and I'll talk about that, but they're really bandits who become kings and high priests and take the high priestly position as well. So another arising out of this is the corruption of the high priesthood. This is a huge deal during this period, all the way into the New Testament. It becomes it becomes a position that's open to certain men based on birth and money, and less on being born into that one single line of family of father to son. But also then, so Antiochus, the rise of the Hasmoneans, the corruption of the high priesthood, and then finally over all of this is the Jewish traditionalists to call people like Ananias versus the Hellenistic Jews. This is in many ways the fuel for the fire within the Jewish community. How much do we become Greek and still remain Jewish? And how much do we have to resist Greek influence in order to remain faithful to the covenant and to God? So, if you have any questions, let me know. But hopefully, this makes a certain degree of sense. Like I said, don't get bogged down in the dates as much as I want you to know which figures interacted with other figures, and how particularly these last three things were at play in all of that.